having my childhood lived out somewhere like Patches was in some ways wonderful, but in other ways it was incredibly risky, and it was born out of trauma, like my trauma to escape my family, my trauma to find a place in a homophobic society that legislated against me. It was my way of rising up out of that trauma. And I was actually experiencing trauma at the time through all of those years. So I don't really want to go back there. I appreciate what it was. I'm thankful for the experience. I wish everybody that I ever met there, even the people who weren't kind to me, I wish them well, and I hope they're happy and productive people if they survived. But it's not something that I need to go back and try and reclaim.
I am Kay Anderson, and you are listening to Lost Spaces, a podcast that mourns the death of queer nightlife. Every episode, I talk to a different person about a venue from their past, the memories they created there, and the people that they used to know. Sean O'Callaghan, best known as Fat Gay Vegan, is a freelance writer and one of the world's most popular vegan bloggers. We caught up to talk about Patches, a nightclub in Fortitude Valley, Brisbane, Australia, which provided an escape and an opportunity to meet his tribe when he was growing up in Redcliff in the 80s.
Well, before we would go into Patches, even though we were going to go in before 9 p.m. to get in free and to get the free drink voucher, we couldn't afford to drink much or at all inside the bar because we had no money, being children. So we would go to a parking sort of lot around the corner, and we would buy bottles of cheap spumante. There was a drink that we used to drink called Passion Pop. And it was a very, very famous drink around the time for anyone who was a teenager in the 80s or early 90s. And it was usually 99 cents a bottle. And it was like the size of a bottle of champagne, but it was the cheapest sparkling spumante. And you could sometimes buy a case, like 12 bottles for $10. And it was just ridiculous. And we used to go and drink around the corner, so pre-drink before we went into the club.
Sensible.
And it's where we would hang out. And one evening we were there, and I mean, we looked really gay. Like, I was in makeup, I was in shorts and makeup and a blouse, like a pink chiffon blouse tied at my waist, and nothing on underneath it. And I had like one of those, do you remember those Indian style woven bags that were like you'd wear over your shoulder, and they were all the rage in Australia?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Like multicolored woven bag. And I had that with me. First of all, the police came and made us tip all of our alcohol into the gutter down the drain. They said, "How old are you?" And we were like all saying we were 21 when I was 15, and we were lying to them. They tipped my bag out onto the bonnet of the cop car, and all of my things went over, and they were all like signifiers of how gay I was. And so the police officer was like picking up my makeup, and one of the women I was with said, "Oh, that's my makeup. He's holding it for me." And then I had a copy in there because I thought I was so romantic and ridiculous. I had a copy of The Happy Prince and Other Short Stories by Oscar Wilde. And this police officer picked the book up and waved it in my face and said, "The Happy Prince, eh?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I was so scared because, it was like this massive signifier that I was like a screaming queen, and this police officer had every right to arrest me because it was illegal to be gay. So anyway, eventually they poured all our alcohol into the drain. They gave us our things back and told us to go away. And they didn't believe we were 18, but they couldn't do anything about it. And they sent us on our way, and we ran straight to the club and went into the club.
Yeah. But like also kind of what kind of dickheads were the police like to just terrorize kids like that? Like what?
Yeah, well, they had power, and at the time it was illegal to be gay in Queensland. Homosexuality was decriminalised in 1990. So when I started going out in 1988, it was against the law to be gay. So not only could you be bashed for, looking too gay or too effeminate, the police could also harass you. And we used to get harassed by the police all the time on the way to the clubs.
And so, like even just being on a train dressed up, ready to go out meant that you would attract lots of stares and attention from other people.
Yeah, and we lived in, at the time I lived in a very, it was kind of like, it's a big city, but it's kind of got a country town feel. I know you've had another guest on talking about the terminus. And it's very hard to describe to people who didn't live through that. But we had a very right-wing, extreme right-wing government. And the police department at the time in Brisbane, in Queensland, was considered one of the most corrupt in the world. And there was just a lot of police violence, a lot of black deaths in custody, like young black people, young black men especially, Indigenous Australians, were killed by the police in custody. And there was a lot of targeting anybody who didn't look, inverted commas, normal. And so that carried on from, obviously, if you've got a police force like that, it gives people license to, be more aggressive themselves. You only have to look what's happening in the US with their politics and how, if you have an outspoken leader who attacks immigrants, more people feel emboldened to attack immigrants. And so we really lived through a time where if you were anything other than, a white, average-looking suburban person, you were up for ridicule. I mean, we used to get chased by people who said they were going to, beat us up. We'd be all my memories of being a young teenager is running away from something.
Oh, oy vey. So on that first train journey, I know you said you don't remember the first time that you went there, but, generally there is that when you're going to a club, when you're going out for a night out, there's a feeling of kind of excitement and anticipation. When you were on the train, how, I don't know what I'm asking really. Did you have to play that down? Did you have to try and act less conspicuous?
I was probably too excited to play it down. And I can remember what I wore to the first time I went to the club. And I can remember wearing white knee-length shorts, white knee-length socks, black canvas slip-on shoes, and a black and white striped, sort of like a sailor shirt. So I looked like, like a 14-year-old child dressed like a 4-year-old child. But it was like the fashion at the time was, it was like, think back to what like Bananarama would have worn in a video, or, even like a T-shirt that Rick Astley might have worn for a photo shoot. It was like very camp. It was very influenced by gay and house music culture from around the world, and then very influenced by pop stars coming out of the UK. And so I think I might have even had slightly longer hair, and I had my hair back in a bandana sort of bun. It was every week it was like a fashion show. We thought we were like the height of fashion, and it was whatever we could get for free or steal or borrow from older siblings or friends. And I sent a photo through to you showing you one of the outfits that I wore. And now that shirt, I was either stolen from like a secondhand clothing store. You can't really see the detail in the photo, but I was actually wearing a crucifix and a rosary beads at the same time, probably influenced by Madonna.
Maybe, just maybe, yeah.
Yeah. And so, I was like, we used to go out one week and say, okay, we're Madonna. And the next week I'd go out and I'm like, okay, I'm Pete Burns. Or the next week I'd go out and I'd be like, okay, I'm Kylie. I'm in like a crop denim jacket and 501s that somebody lent me because I had no money to get them myself. And so I could be that for 1 week. And it was really a way for us to play out all of our fashion fantasies because we were poor kids, we were queer kids. We didn't have that world at our disposal. So we just do it by dressing up.
Mm. And so you said earlier that the friends that you had at the time were a bit older. How much older is a bit older?
I would say they were, if I was 14, they would be 17.
Okay. And what was your tactic then for getting into the club?
I was told that there was no hassle getting into this club, that you could just go in. And I don't think I was ever stopped going into Patches. I don't think anyone ever asked me anything. So many underage people were in there. I knew so many other people my age or slightly older. I mean, certainly there would be nights where you could get in there and free before 9 p.m. You could look around and it was all just the kids who had no money who needed to get in before 9 p.m. I think the owner or the manager of Patches was known as possibly, now this, I'm not trying to get anyone in trouble here, but we always saw him with,
this is going.
we always saw him with younger boyfriends.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I'm not saying he dated underage people. Like, there's no evidence of that. And I'm not saying that I even think that. But he had younger looking boyfriends. And it was, I don't know if that informed his door policy, that he wanted young people to have a safe place to go. I'm not sure.
Can you describe the venue to me then?
Okay, so the venue was on a street called Brunswick Street, and it was like the nightclub district, but really seedy. So people who wanted to go to like a nightclub that felt a bit safer would go to the sort of central business district of the city of Brisbane. But this area was called Fortitude Valley. Mm-hmm. That's the name of the suburb, and it's still there. And so it's where a lot of the queer and punk clubs would spring up, sometimes illegally. There were a lot of empty buildings, and so, we would sometimes sleep in some of the empty buildings if we were tired of the club and we had to wait for the train or we had nowhere to go. And Patches was part of like a mega club. So there was a big club downstairs called the Roxy, and it was sometimes they would have big dance parties there, and it had an internal staircase that led to the upstairs club, which is where Patches was, and they would open that doorway up, that internal stairwell, for special occasions, like if there was a huge dance party, which I can talk about later. But so it was a smaller club upstairs. It wasn't tiny. You could probably fit a couple of hundred people in it. Mm-hmm. And it was just run-of-the-mill seedy nightclub. Like, it had sticky carpet. Everything was dreary and dirty. I can remember one night being on the dance floor with my friend Peter, and she was wearing like a fake fur bolero jacket, and we were dancing to whatever we were dancing to. Like, I can't remember at the time, but the disco light above us, it was like a strobe light, caught fire, and like this plastic started dripping down that was on fire, and some went on a jacket, and everyone ran for the door. Like all these underage kids in this like illegal sort of like dingy nightclub ran for the door, and then somebody put it out with the fire extinguisher, and we all came back and started dancing again. And probably dancing to New Order or Pet Shop Boys or something, thinking we're the coolest people on the planet.
And luckily at the time everything would have smelled of cigarette smoke, so the plastic burning smell would have been covered up quite quickly. Oh
yeah, exactly right. There was always a mixture. The smell in Patches was always cigarettes, or the drink of the day was vodka and orange juice. Like, everyone just used to drink that. I don't know if it was cheap or if it's what teenagers would be used to drinking, because it's what you could make at a party. So everyone used to just drink vodka and orange juice. The place was sticky with it.
So can we talk a bit about your life in Redcliff? And I guess, first of all, can you give us a bit of an indication of what Redcliff was like at that time?
Redcliff is a seaside town, and, to quote the famous racist Morrissey, it's a seaside town that they forgot to close down. And it really was a brutal place to grow up, like, especially if you're a queer person. It was like a lower socioeconomic neighborhood with a lot of really rough people, majority white, and they just hated anything that was different. So yeah, we would get chased out of parties. We would get chased just from sitting at the beach all the time. And so it wasn't a nice place to grow up. I had a very unhappy home life as well. I moved out of home when I was 15. I left school when I was 15. I started full-time employment, and it just doesn't have very good memories for me. I visited for the first time in decades. Last year, I visited Australia. I hadn't been to Australia in 10 years. And I went back, and my sister took me for a drive around Redcliff, and it triggered me so badly. I don't have many good memories of it. And it was the sort of town where, obviously it was illegal to be gay. And so that created a culture where it was very hard to come out to friends. And so a lot of the gay things that happened were very underground, or I often found myself gravitating towards older people, sometimes to my detriment, older people who didn't have my best interests at heart. And, it's typical for a lot of young queer people who get taken advantage of or coerced into situations. And so, but I did have some good friends as well, and they were the ones who kind of steered me away from the town and, to the city that was, half an hour, 40 minutes away. And that's where we, sort of built our own scene on the, with the underground nightclubs and the queer spaces. We didn't really have any queer spaces other than, the public toilets at the local beach in Redcliff.
Every town has.
Yeah, right. And so, finding queer identity, I don't think I could really do. I couldn't create a full queer identity in Redcliff. It was kind of going to the next biggest city to do that. And I think that's true for a lot of young people around the world.
Yeah, but it's kind of surprising, maybe that's not the right word, that you were able to find some kind of allies. You were able to find some other queer people there in the town. Did you meet them through school or in other ways?
Yeah, so I was the youngest of 4 children. And my 3 sisters, all older than me, but we were all within the space of about 5 years. And so a lot of my musical tastes and the people that I hung out with were informed by my sisters. And I can remember one day, I don't know, I was raving about Morrissey, or I was raving about Madonna, and I was like being super gay, listening to Dead or Alive. And my elder sister, Michelle, said to me, "Oh, you should talk to this guy, his name. I won't say his name, but he hangs out with our group and he's a big Madonna fan." And that was her way of saying to me, "Oh, I think he's queer and you're queer, and I think you should hang out." And so it was through my elder sister's friends. And so my sister is about 4.5 years older than me. It was through her friends that I started to hang out with and go to parties and start to go to the clubs like Patches and Terminus with. And she was able to introduce me to people that she knew to be kind of like more mindful or safer people to be around because they all hung around together.
So Madonna bringing queers together
for decades.
Maybe we need to let her know. She probably knows already, doesn't she?
She knows and she doesn't care.
She's too busy in her bathtub making videos right now.
Yeah, she's too busy wearing her jewels in her bathtub.
I mean, without going too far off topic, I do quite enjoy the approach that she's taking now, where 0 fucks are given. But so, like, without being... I know this is going to sound like a really weird, dumb question, but what does a 17-year-old see in a 14-year-old?
Well, to be, openly, brutal about this, there were people even in that group that I hung around that probably weren't acting in my best interest. Like, I was coerced into sexual situations from the age of 13 and 14 that I probably shouldn't have been in. And if these people had been educated and had been mindful and had been compassionate, they wouldn't have put me in. But often as a queer child, you find yourself drawn to the underdog or the outskirts of society or the underbelly, and it puts you more at risk. And so some of them just saw a kindred spirit in me and wanted to be my friend and look after me. And some of them saw me as someone to have sex with. And I think that happens to a lot of young queer people. And it's really a story that we don't tell a lot of, and that we need to, even these days, talk to young queer people about self-determination around their own sexuality, and that how it should be on their terms. But saying that, growing up in a state where it was illegal to even be a homosexual adult, there was nobody for me to go to and say, hey, is this okay that somebody wants to have sex with me? Is this okay that somebody wants to have unprotected sex with me, even though Madonna's telling me to wear a condom? You know, it was very a difficult situation for me because I had run away from abusive parents, that I was looking to older people for guidance, and I didn't always get good guidance from people.
And that's the kind of hard thing as well, isn't it? Because people that have a problem with queerness are always focused on sexual acts and are always focused on genitals. And so when you're growing up in a homophobic environment, that is what you equate your queerness with. It's very easy for you to equate your queerness with sex and the act of sex. And so, I mean, you know, on top of all of the pressure that you might feel in order, like, to make people like you, there is that kind of thing at the back of your mind about, like, this is what I need to do because this is who I am, because this is what society tells me.
Also, I mean, if you place it historically within a queer context, 1987 and 1988, think of where that was within the HIV and AIDS calendar of events.
Yeah.
And there was so much shame and stigma that if you were gay, I mean, my first memory of ever hearing anyone talk about HIV was when I was very young, and I was sitting on a balcony with my mother and my auntie and some cousins, and they were talking about, a gay cancer, and that faggots deserved it, and that's what happens. That's my first memory. And so growing up in that environment around people who had that mentality, in an environment where it was state sanctioned that it was against the law to be gay. Plus there were adverts running on TV with the Grim Reaper saying, you know, hey, this is what AIDS does to you, and the Grim Reaper would bowl a bowling ball and knock people over. That's where I came of age. And it was very hard to, I mean, there was zero people to turn to talk about my sexuality or my queerness. And the only people that I would often find willing to talk to me were older men who wanted to have sex. And that was it. Who wanted to have sex with young boys.
Yeah. That is shit. I'm sorry that you went through that.
Yeah.
And so if we go back to Patches, you obviously went there. It sounds like you went there with kind of a gaggle of people, a group of people. Was that quite an insular group, or did you make new friends in the venue?
Yeah, we would make new friends. So we would go, I would go with people from Redcliff, and then we would branch off. We would meet other people. Like, I remember one of my friends made a boyfriend who lived in the sort of gayborhood, which is called New Farm. It's the next suburb over from where Patches was. And my friend Jeffrey went off and, you know, moved in with his boyfriend, and we were all jealous that he was living this, you know, cosmopolitan, you know, ridiculous lifestyle, living with his boyfriend, who I think was a flight attendant. And we were all so jealous. I mean, I was 15 at the time. I'm not sure what I thought was going on. Like, I was somehow going to move in with a middle-aged man in, you know, the gayborhood. And so a lot of people would just disappear, of course. Now, I know that a lot of that would have to do with HIV and AIDS, because it was really at the height of that pandemic, and when it was really affecting queer communities all over the world, and that we would often lose friends without even knowing. And because nobody spoke about it, especially like 87, 88, 89, 90, when it was illegal to be gay, you didn't hear about it. People's families wouldn't contact you, or they wouldn't come to the queer club to look for friends of their family. People would just disappear.
Oh gosh.
So yeah, we did make friends. And you know, Patches only really lived a short while. For me, it had a big explosion. It was really popular. But then other clubs sprung up and we moved on. And so it was like this snapshot in time where it was like all these young, mostly underage queer kids, you know, dancing to Bananarama, you know, dressing like Kylie's first album. And then it kind of, we moved on to other clubs. And, you know, especially as music styles changed, there was another club down the road, about a 5-minute walk, called The Beat, And I think it's still there. And I think it's now called the Mega Beat. And the Beat has been there decades. And it was like, I think maybe the longest running queer club or gay-owned club. I'm not sure who owns it now. But their music started to be a lot more dance-orientated and less pop or avant-garde or new wave, which Patches was more of that. And so...
and so you thought you were too cool for pop. Is that what happened?
Yeah, well, I think Patches was just always on a knife edge. Like, it couldn't last. I mean, with the amount of underage kids in there and, it was very dependent on a certain trend of music. And when that trend shifted radically, I mean, when things like Black Box started hitting the mainstream and like went to number one in Australia, like songs like Right on Time and things like that, they weren't an underground concern anymore. I mean, that's what we thought made us different, listening to house records that a DJ had snuck in from like New York or LA or London. And so then when they started to become big hits, or then like later around 1990 with like bands like Snap, and those sorts of sounds that were ours and were the underground and were the queer became the mainstream. Something like Patches just kind of faded away.
So it didn't adapt to meet the times.
No, and I just don't think it could. There were probably other problems there as well. I can remember the owner of the bar towards the end when the clientele started to dip in numbers. He started to get a bit angry with people, and he became famous for banning people from his club.
On what grounds? Just very tenuous ones.
Anything. He banned me. I made a joke about him with his boyfriend. He was with one of his young boyfriends, and I said something flippant or campy, like, "Oh, your boyfriend's cute. Can I have his number?" or something. And he said, "You're out of here, Queen. You're banned for life." And for years, that was my catchphrase. Like, people used to say it to me, "You're out of here, Queen." And and so I got banned. And then, it was probably only a month or two later that the club closed down. I can't even remember what year that was, but I was probably still underage.
Okay, so you first went there when you were 14, and then you said that you moved out of home when you were 15. And so did you move to Brisbane then?
When I first moved out of home, I moved into a house in Redcliff, because where I worked was kind of halfway between Redcliff and Brisbane, and I also couldn't afford. I was worked in a shop, so I couldn't afford the rents of the inner city. So I actually moved in with one of my sisters, who had also moved out of home because of our bad family life, and we also had another friend that we used to hang out with, who was just one of the neighborhood kids who was also queer and hung around us, and so we all had full-time retail jobs, and we all, shared like this crummy little house in the suburbs near the beach. And I used to have to walk to work. I worked in a shoe store. It was quite awful.
But are there like skills for life that you got out of that? Like, could you tell me my shoe size if you met me?
I might not be able to tell you your shoe size, but there are things that stick with me, like, the best way to treat certain types of leather, or I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Well, that's very useful for you now, isn't it?
Yes, as a vegan who goes nowhere near leather.
I worked in retail for a while, and there was a time, and maybe I just haven't actually tried, but there was a time when I could just tell any man what waist size he was. Actually, maybe that's not that impressive.
No. I think you just like looking at people's waists.
No. It's just like I know I've got this. You're a 34. Anyway. So what was that like then, that kind of liberation of having moved out of home?
It was terrifying. I mean, I was dating someone who was 19, he was just awful. He was a hairdresser, and it was an abusive relationship. I'm sorry, I don't mean to make this sound like oh, this is like the biggest downer ever. I know your your discussions normally revolve around, the importance of queer spaces.
So sorry. Do you feel uncomfortable talking about this?
No,
Oh, okay.
I don't think so, because I think it's important to have clarity and truth about what it was like for young queer people, especially at that time. It was very difficult for a lot of us. We didn't have support networks. And I know that it's still difficult for queer people now. And even for me as a middle-aged queer person, it's difficult. But for younger people, I like to believe and I like to support organizations that look after young queer people. And I think there's a lot more of that. But at the time, that didn't really exist.
I just want to be straight up with you, I suppose, that I don't have any expectations for this being like a fun interview or anything. So I'm happy for it to go wherever it goes. And I don't want you to feel any kind of you have to apologize for that or anything.
Okay, well, now that you've given me the green light, grab the tissues because we're going really deep.
Ooh, okay. Sorry. No, I just went off into like a pep talk then, didn't I?
Yes. But I mean, going back to that, that house and those first sort of share houses that I lived in, it was really a difficult time because I was working full time. I was, a teenager, a child, and I was going clubbing at least one night a week. I was drinking beyond what a human should drink. I mean, before we went out, I would do things like drink 2 bottles of wine or drink a bottle of vodka on my own at, 14, 15 years of age, and then go out clubbing until 5 a.m. And I would find myself in extremely dangerous and risky situations because of that. And, there are people that hang around young, vulnerable people to take advantage of that. And so it was dangerous, and there were other people in my circumstance who didn't survive. I wrote a book 2 years ago, and in the book I talk about how I think I'm still alive because of my privilege, whether that be my white privilege or my male privilege or my non-disabled privilege. And there were other people my age who I knew in my town who got killed in hate crimes because maybe they didn't enjoy some of the same privileges that I had. They didn't present the same way as me, and so they were targeted more. And so I did grow up in a very violent area, and I was part of a demographic that was very targeted by violence. So yeah, it was tough. But there was also good things about it as well, if you want to try and say some positive things.
No, but so I grew up in Adelaide, and Adelaide is not, it's not a small town, and I never had any kind of instances of violence or anything like that in growing up, but it was still like hugely oppressive for me, and it felt very I felt very unwelcome in most places that I was, and that would even kind of seep into where I live. And so I guess, it's interesting that you're in this share house, kind of in the town that didn't accept you, and trying to transition, I suppose, from that a child to an adult. And sorry, were you living with your boyfriend, or you were just dating?
No, I was just dating him.
Yeah.
And, I don't even know how long that lasted. He was just not a very nice person, and he probably had a lot of problems of his own. But, we were kind of caught in this really weird space, like young queer people my age who were growing up in Redcliff and Brisbane. We were caught between, so, we had all these pop stars and sort of fashion people that we looked up to that made us believe that being queer was okay. And I knew that, being camp and listening to music and going dancing, and that was meant to be celebrated. But then we were also caught between a really homophobic, overarching culture, and especially with the right in the thick of everything with HIV and AIDS. It was very, we were terrorized by the mediocrity of where we lived, and we were punished for not fitting into those molds. And then we would also go out to these gay bars where we would find solidarity and with other young people our age. But then there would also be the old guard of the queer community that resisted us as well. So we would go to Patches, and there would sometimes be like sort of the older drag performers. I can remember there was a drag performer called Hazel LaBelle, and she was much older. I mean, she would have been in her 50s or 60s, and she was part of the really old underground drag scene in Brisbane. And there was a party that used to happen once a year called the Queen's Ball, and it was a big drag pageant. So, you hear about, old-fashioned drag pageants that used to happen in like Harlem, and that we had one in Brisbane that started in the 60s, I think, and it happened every year right up until the early or mid 90s, and it was called the Queen's Ball. So all of us young queer kids would go along, but then there'd be all the old school, old guard drag queens, in their pageant gowns and with the old fashioned names and the movie star names. And so we had a real culture clash even there. So we were running away from the mediocrity and the danger of the suburbs, but then also clashing with the old gay guys who were, the old fashioned drag performers.
And so these old guards, do you think that they were resistant to you being there? Or was it like more of a older generation, younger generation, we don't really get each other kind of thing?
Yeah, no, I think people supported each other and looked after each other, but it was really a clash of cultures. So not so much a deliberate thing. I can remember the guy who ran Patches. He started a dance party, an annual dance party called the Sleaze Ball. Now, the Sleaze Ball had been going in Sydney for a few years before this, and he wanted to bring sort of a touch of that, whatever it was, like the vibe of a sleaze ball, which celebrated more fluid sexuality and more queerness instead of like gay and lesbian identities. He wanted to bring that to Brisbane. And I can remember there being a bit of resistance to that. Like some of the older queens thought it was a little bit improper. And the Queen's Ball, when I remember going to them, and the Sleaze Ball as well, happened in Patches and the neighbouring nightclub called the Roxy, and they would have the internal staircase, and you would be able to go between the two venues, and they'd have different type of music. You'd have drag and you'd have the pageant, and then they brought in like for the Sleaze Ball, they brought in like the Mr. Leatherman Australia competition, and they would have that on the stage, and then there would be drag queens, and then upstairs there'd be sort of the more, I suppose, younger or more modern music DJs spinning. And so, yeah, for a few years, it was a really nice culmination of everyone coming together.
Do you remember then your first drag show, or kind of what your first impressions of drag were?
No, I don't remember. I don't remember. I can remember drag being, like when you see drag now, and even in the last 10 years, drag has evolved a lot. It really was. My first memories of drag was the very old school pageant style drag. And, when I remember seeing drag in 1988, it was drag performers who'd been doing it for years. Maybe some of them had even been dressing in drag privately or at parties for decades. When I was a teenager, an older man started a relationship with me, and he was much older. He would have been in his 30s or 40s when I was a teenager. And he was a female impersonator, and he was a Dame Edna impersonator. And that's the sort of old school drag I'm talking about. People thought that was, that was clever, gender illusion. And then, like in Patches, we used to have different types of entertainment that would come up and through, like especially younger people who had traveled or they'd read magazines or heard about things, would try and bring outside influences to our dance floors in Patches. And I can remember there was a man and a woman, I can't remember their names. I think one of them was called Michelle, and they had a fashion label, like this avant-garde fashion label called Dressed for Sex. And I can remember one night in Patches in 1988 where they did a fashion show and they were voguing. And so it was like, 2 years before Madonna did it. And so we really had no concept of that as a movement or as an art form in Australia. Some people would have, and things like that spring up all over the world. But it was really born and made popular in the Black and Latino neighborhoods of New York and inner city USA. And so these two people were with their horrible clothes that were all like hacked together out of Hessian or something, with like outrageous words. Like I think it was kind of inspired by like Sex by Vivienne Westwood and it was all that, and they called it Dress for Sex, and they were voguing.
But hang on, Dressed for Sex in Hessian.
I know, right? It's a little uncomfortable. It might have been calico. I don't know. It was a stiff material. Let's just put it that way.
Oh, geez.
And so I can remember saying to my friends, "What are they doing? Like, what dance is that?" Like, they were on the floor. They were voguing, and I was just like, "That's really fascinating." And then, so a few years later, Madonna came out, and like stole the concept and repackaged it and made a lot of money from it. Yeah. We were like, oh, yeah, that's what Michelle and Dressed for Sex were doing like 2 years ago. And, so we felt like we were really underground. We felt like we were stuff that was just being forced through innovation. And also, like, I was a kid, like stuff like that felt amazing to me because I never saw anything like it. If I stayed at home, my cultural influences were like In Excess, or maybe Kylie's first record, or Neighbours, or Danny Minogue being on Young Talent Time, or that was the cultural apex for me. And so going to these underground clubs where lights were catching on fire and people were voguing, and I could dress however I wanted to. It was amazing to me. It was very liberating, and it did give me as much as bad things happened to me, and as much as I was at risk, it was a very liberating and explosive time in my life.
And it's that at that age as well, isn't it? It's like when everything else is shit, there is always Saturday night.
Yes, and we would work in dead-end jobs for next to no money, and it would be just to get to the club. It would be and near Patches, and directly opposite the terminus, which you've spoken about before, there was the Brunswick Street train station, and that's where we used to all come out of the train on our way to the club, and that's where you would say you'd meet people on the concourse near the shops. And so it would be kind of like the Saturday evening fashion parade. You'd like walk out in like the latest thing that you've stolen from the charity shop, or your new haircut that you got done for free, or someone's dyed your hair. And I can remember one night walking out in a pair of tartan trousers, but they were like balloon leg. They were about 3 foot wide, the leg. And I'd put elastic tape up the side, so when I walked, they bounced. And I had a ribbed, like it was like a pearl white ribbed turtleneck sweater on with these tartan trousers. I had half my head shaved. The other half was spiral permed, really long, like down to my shoulder, and dyed bright red, like fire engine red. And I can remember walking out into the concourse. It was like our little fashion parade before we went into the club. And I can remember so people said I looked amazing and gave me a round of applause, and I got my, people kikied, and I felt like, I've got a little bit of attention. But looking back now, I must have looked like a circus clown. I must, and I didn't know how to do makeup. So I would like pluck my eyebrows. I'd put like eyeliner on. All of my cosmetics were stolen from the local pharmacy. Like Terry White Chemist, I'm sorry, but you got me through some rough years and some bad skin situations as a teenager. And I would have pancake foundation on, eyeliner, just whatever color eyeshadow I could find. Didn't know how to do it. And I just thought I was fabulous. And our outfits would change like this all the time. I'd have lace and chiffon midriffs. I would have sometimes like white t-shirt and 501s and a leather jacket and think I was Kylie. And other times I would dress like I was in Dead or Alive. Sometimes we'd dress like really punk. And it was a really fun experimental time for our fashion. And I enjoy that element of it looking back.
So the obvious question that I have to ask now is when I'm going to see more photographic evidence of this.
Do you know, I was a really poor kid, and I grew up in a time where we didn't have technology, obviously. We didn't have phones. And
sounds like an excuse is coming on.
No, it is an excuse. and it's like, I just don't have those photos. And I moved around so much as a child. And then in my 20s, I moved out of Australia for over 10 years. And I lost everything. I don't have many photos. There are there's a handful of photos floating around, mostly with friends.
Isn't it this, like, it's kind of like both a relief and a shame that there are not that many photos.
Well, I'm not embarrassed, as you can tell by my my storytelling. There's nothing that I'll hold back with. If the photos are out there, I'm happy for them to be spread around. But yeah, I think it's a shame for queer culture that a lot of this wasn't documented. I mean, before we spoke and I told you the name of the club, you said there seems to be very little online about it. I think there is one listing online about it. For a club that was so important to queer Brisbane and that nurtured so many young people, and it's a shame. It's a crying shame that it's not somewhere in the archives. I'm sure there must be. There must be photographs. There must be flyers from club nights. There must be flyers for the Queen's Ball and the Sleaze Ball. There must be news articles about when the place was raided for having children in there. Or, there must be content out there.
Did it get raided?
Probably. I've made that up for dramatic effect for your podcast.
Sorry, I was like, I need this story.
But what I'm saying is, like, this stuff must exist, but it hasn't been digitized. So we'd need someone to go back through archives, like newspaper archives around the time. We need people to get in contact with, like, gay and lesbian archives in Australia to find out about it, because it just doesn't exist. Like, some of your other guests that I've listened to, they're like reeling stuff off the top of their head. And I'm like, okay, they must have looked that up online before they were chatting to you. But I don't have the pleasure of doing that. Everything that I remember or misremember is on me, because this stuff doesn't exist out there.
Do you remember when homosexuality was decriminalised?
Yes, it was in 1990.
And do you remember what that felt like?
I can remember thinking, well, that just chips away a little bit of someone's reason to hate me. Like, it's not state sanctioned, so they've got less reason to hate me. And I can remember it feeling very begrudging. Like, I can remember the government at the time and the public sentiment was, look, we understand that whatever anyone does in the privacy of their own relationship or their own home shouldn't be a criminal offense, but we still hate fags. Like, that was the feeling I got. Now, I'm not saying that all queer people felt that was the sentiment, but certainly for me, it felt like that. And, we still hear those sorts of things now. Like, guys all around the world, people all around the world say, oh, I don't mind you being gay, just don't ram it down my throat.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's what it felt like. It felt like, here, we'll not lock you up for being gay, just don't do it in front of us.
Yeah. I have a real bugbear with the word tolerant as well. Like, we'll tolerate you. It's like, okay, thanks.
Yeah, so when people say that to me and they're like, oh, I tolerate, queer people, or I tolerate gay people, and I'm like, yes, but do you celebrate us?
Yeah. Like,
two very different things. I want to be celebrated, not tolerated.
Yeah, tolerate makes, it's just such a horrible word.
Yeah, like I'll tolerate you, I won't kick you to death.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, good news, everyone. And so did you notice any kind of difference in your day-to-day life?
I sometimes wonder if the demise of Patches was related to the decriminalisation of homosexuality, in that such a dangerous underground place that was on the edge of society didn't need to exist anymore. Because after that happened, more sort of, they were still queer and they were still part of the queer community, but more mixed gay and queer clubs started opening. Like, there was a place called Options, and it was a gay nightclub in the Spring Hill neighborhood of Brisbane. And that opened up shortly after the demise of Patches and the Terminus. And you would go there and dance, and there would be a lot more of a mixed crowd. So it was identifiably LGBT, but I would meet friends there who were straight identifying.
Oh, okay.
And so, instead of just dancing to Bananarama and, and watching, early Innovators Vogue, you'd be dancing to George Michael, solo dance records that were more palatable to straight audiences.
Not in excess.
No, we'd never danced in excess in the gay clubs. We would have burnt the place down if that had happened. Listen, I love in excess, but there's a place and a time for things, and a queer club is not one of those. And so, the gay club started to change. And so you'd go to the club that I mentioned called The Beat, and The Beat would be a lot of straight people in there. And a club called The Wickham opened up, which still exists there today. And it would be like your straight friends would say, "Oh, do you mind if I come to the Wickham with you this weekend, for a Sunday session or whatever?" And so it started to be more accessible because it must have been directly related to the decriminalisation of homosexuality.
And that's it's kind of remarkable if that was happening like within a year or whatever of decriminalisation. If heterosexual people who have been conditioned their entire life to be like gay bad were suddenly like, "Oh, hey, can I come to this club with you?"
Yeah. And I mean people who I worked with in the shoe stores and the department stores that I worked with who were really straight-laced, sort of straight down the line, weren't queer in any sense of the word, were willing and wanting to come to gay clubs because they heard that they were fun. And then, it was no longer dangerous. It was no longer seen as an illegal thing to do, like literally an illegal thing to do. It was.
Yeah. An elite. It's kind of mind-blowing. But and so was it kind of treated like a kind of queer tourism, or was it in a respectful way?
I think most of the people I hung out with, it was very respectful because, to me, like queer identity is very blurred. And I think some of these people found a refuge for the queerness that was in them in a way. Mm-hmm. So I'm not trying to diminish like our queer identities or our realities or our lived experiences. But I think a lot of people have this, this blurred identity where they're not just straight, even though they identify as straight and they present as straight, they still felt some sort of kinship in queer clubs. And so I don't think, people wouldn't go there every weekend like I would, but they would come like once a month or once every 2 months. And it was a way for them to be around their queer friends. It was the way for them to be an ally, and it was a way for them to do something really fun.
Like that kind of thing was tough for me because, because of the privilege that I suppose heterosexual presenting people had, and coming along to clubs and dipping their toe in felt a bit like they were trying to get a thrill.
And that happens to most minority society, minority communities, that people do come and try and slum it for a while and see how the dangerous people live. And that does happen. But speaking from my own experience, there were people like that, but there were also people who I genuinely felt an allyship from. And I didn't mind them coming into the space so much. But of course, straight people coming to gay places often spells the end of it. It kind of like loses its edge, and it's like, "Oh, Becky's there every week? Yeah, I'm not going anymore."
Oh, Becky, poor Becky. And do you remember hearing about Patches closing?
No, it kind of just disappeared. And I was in Brisbane at the time. It would have been not long after I went there, but it just kind of disappeared.
And you said before that you'd kind of moved on to the next club anyway.
Yeah, well, the last time I was ever in there was when the manager banned me for life. You're out of it. And, I'd moved on, like going back to the Beat and then to the Wickham, and then, a little bit later to Options. up in Spring Hill. And then we just never heard of it again. I don't know. I'm sure there are people around on the scene who knows exactly what happened. There were rumors that the owner went and opened a cafe or a garden centre in North Brisbane, but nobody knows. That was all just, queer rumours on the scene that he opened a cafe. I mean, it might be true. Like, it might be that he got out of the whole nightclub business completely. But yeah, we don't know what happened. But, with the demise of Patches, we really lost an alternative queer scene. We really lost that where you could be dangerous with how you looked. You could be dangerous with exploring your sexuality. And it lost that underground edge. And then it became a lot more sanitized. And with the decriminalisation, it became a lot more commodified.
So this kind of watering down of the culture in the city, and do you think that's that has a direct relationship with the decriminalisation?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was. So it was around the time there was an investigative report into how corrupt the police force was. And around the same time, there was a change in government from the extreme right-wing government to a more left-leaning government. And things started to feel a little bit more progressive. Mm-hmm. And so I suppose queerness was able to come out of the shadows a little bit where it had been forced. And when something comes out of the shadows, it often becomes, sanitized a little bit or made to be more palatable. Or, when people outside the queer scene wanted to experience the queer scene, it brought in influences that weren't as extreme or isolated. Mm-hmm. They were more mainstream influences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah, it's tough. And making people understand why you need self-determination, or why you need to steer and control your own spaces as a queer person. It's very hard to get people to understand that. And it's hard to make young people understand how crucial those spaces were like 30 years ago. What it meant to be like an outlaw, what it meant to be someone who was considered, the reason why there was HIV and AIDS sweeping the world, why it was considered, why we needed these safe spaces that weren't always completely safe, but why we needed these self-determined spaces to explore our queerness in. It's very hard to even get young queer people to understand what that meant to us.
Did you ever go to Patches? Well, if you did, I would love to hear from you. Tell me your stories and share any anecdotes or photos through social media. And if your photos are half as good as Sean's, then I want to see them. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram under the user handle KAndersonMusic. You can also find out more about Sean at www.fatgayvegan.com and read his book, Fat Gay Vegan, Eat, Drink, and Live Like You Give a Shit. Lost Spaces is not only a podcast, but a concept record as well. I've been writing songs about queer venues and the people who used to live their lives there, and will be releasing songs over the coming year. You can hear the first single, Well Groomed Boys, which is also playing underneath my talking right this very second, on all streaming platforms. If you liked this episode, I would really appreciate if you subscribed, left a review on Apple Podcasts, or just told people or someone or something who you think might be interested as well. I am Kay Anderson, and thank you for listening to Lost Spaces.